I'm Jane from Jane White Tuition. Thank you for signing up for my How to Insert a Conceal Zipper workshop. We'll be putting these most modern and really beautiful of fastenings in. There's going to be no pucker at the bottom, there's going to be no sticking up at the top. It might be a slightly different method if you've done one before. There'll be more steps and we will be tacking, but I promise you, you'll get a really good result. So give it a go, I'm sure you'll be fine, and don't forget to let me know how you get on. We're going to be using what's been nicknamed the magic pin method. That was one of the students' name for it. But I hope at the end of it, you'll get a perfectly inserted zip with no sticking up at the top and no pucker at the bottom. The first thing to note with the conceal zip is, and it didn't occur to me until somebody came with the wrong zip, a conceal zip is different to a standard zip that perhaps we've been used to using in the past. If you have a look at the one on the left-hand side, which is the concealed or invisible zip, I always think of it as a back to front zip. The teeth are on a different side. On this standard zip, you can see that the stopper here and the teeth are on the same side as the zip, whereas the other way around on a concealed zip. The one on the left is a cotton or a polycotton tape, but the one on the right, if you can get a hold of one of these, it's a nylon mesh. They are a lot lighter, and they're particularly good if you've got lighter weight fabrics like summer dresses, lightweight skirts, lightweight wools. These are absolutely fine. I find these, you tend to get them on the internet only, but if you can track one down, they're worth buying a few and having them in stock. The other thing is, when you're putting a conceal zip in, you do need a specialist foot. You can do them with the kind of standard zipper foot that came with your sewing machine, but I don't find it very successful, to be honest. It won't be a standard foot as supplied with your sewing machine. You will most probably have to buy it as an extra, and I do recommend that you buy a branded foot. I know you can get them on the internet for £3 or £4 or £5, but if they're not the right size, you're going to really struggle to get your zip in. And the crucial thing is, there's a little hole here on these concealed zip feet on the left, and the needle needs to be right in the middle. If you compare the two, they are quite different to your standard zipper foot, as this one is on the right. This is from a Janome or an Elna. I do like this one. This is an Elna and Janome version, the Z foot. It has this nose at the front, which really helps hold the coil of the teeth in place as you're stitching down. This is the underside of the foot. This is your standard zipper, and you can see it's really smooth and flat, other than these grooves that would normally sit on the coil of the teeth. On your concealed zip foot, you can really see the difference here. They have these two deep grooves down the middle, and they're designed to cling onto the zip teeth and hold them in place while you're machining, which really helps you get as close to the teeth as you can. I find that concealed or invisible zips don't come in as many sizes as a traditional zip. They kind of tend to come in 3. This is like a 9-inch. This would be suitable for a skirt or a pair of trousers. You need to buy a zip that's going to be longer than the gap it's going to go into, and I'll explain about that more as we're going along, but that's one of the key things to getting a really good finish on your zip, is to have a longer zip. It doesn't matter if your zip is far too long, because at the end we can trim the bottom off, bind it off with some thread and trim it off. It's much easier to get in if your zip's longer. Also, the colour match. You don't necessarily get them in as many colours as you do a standard zip, but the only bit you're going to see is this very slim pull here. So get one that's the nearest that you can get. You can always paint the little pull thing with a bit of nail varnish or something if it's still not quite right. You can get universal conceal zips, which are white mesh with a silver stopper and pull. They're really good for kind of pale fabrics. If you've got a garment that you put in the zip in and the fabric's either very fine or it's on a curve, it might be coming across a hip, so you're kind of going across the grain line. If it's going to cause a problem, you can add in a little piece of iron-on interfacing. This is kind of a knitted mesh one that I quite like because it's still got a little bit of movement in it. That'll help it stop it stretching out of shape. If it's really fine fabric, it's going to kind of beef it up a bit, give it a bit more body. Or you can use a bit of soluble stabilizer that they use in machine embroidery. I find that works quite well. Now it's all in the prep for this, as with everything. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to stay stitch on the seam line of your garment. This might be the neckline, it might be the top of the waist on a pair of trousers or a skirt. It needs to be on the seam line. So this sample, I've done it 1.5 centimetres down from the cut edge. If you make your own patterns, you might have more seam allowance, you might have 2.5 centimetres or an inch. Use whatever size stitch you're going to use to machine your garment together. You'll have done a little test run first to get the correct stitch length and machine along on the seam line. A bit of a wobble there, but it's really going to help when we put the top of the zip in. Now we're going to pin our sample or the garment together. This sample, we haven't done any machining for the seam line at all. It's still open. And the first thing we're going to do is you're going to get your pin and you're going to pin together the stay stitching at the top so they match really accurately. Then you're going to smooth and pin down as you go, matching your cut edges. Now I've actually overlocked the raw edges together first because I do find it a lot easier to neaten the seam edges before I put the zip in. It's a bit more tricky afterwards. Now, if you've got an intersecting seam, which you often get on things like dresses, where the bodice meets the waistline, it's really frustrating if at the end it's slipped out of place. This is the first thing that you would pin together. Get yourself a nice kind of sharp, slim pin. I do like these quilter pins because they're quite long, but really sharp, but they've got a fine point on them, and dig it through the ditch on both sides of the seam allowance so that you're actually stitching this kind of bit or pinning this bit here together. And we're going to leave the pin in place, don't take it out. It's the only time really that I would stitch over a pin, and when we get to it, when we're going to temporary machine tack our seam together, you would walk your machine by hand by winding the side wheel carefully over the pin, and that'll stop the fabric shifting backwards and forwards. This is quite thick wool, and it will slip, or if you've got something that's a little bit shiny, it'll stop that happening. This is the next key bit we've got. I'm going to tell you about putting this zip in to stop it sticking up at the top, which is, it doesn't look great, and once your zip's in, it's really awkward to kind of resolve that. And with any zip, you need to make sure that the top of the stopper is sitting slightly below your stay stitching line. If we put the zip stopper, the metal part, right up to here, by the time we've folded over the top for the waistband or the facing or the binding, you're going to end up with the top of the zip sticking up. So I've put a pin in, you can put a bit of chalk or a thread tack or something like that. And I've measured down about 0.3 centimetres, half a centimetre. It is really dependent on the thickness of your fabric. Because this wool is really thick, I've actually done it kind of half a centimetre just to give it a little bit more room to bend over. At the end, you shouldn't have a gap. You shouldn't need a hook and eye. It should sit right flush with the top and it shouldn't be sticking up. And this is the key thing to stop that happening. Now, I'm using this 9-inch zip and I'm going to put 2 marks on it. I'm going to put a mark at the bottom here, which is where the end of the teeth are. And I've measured up an inch, 2.5 centimetres, and I've put another mark. When we put this zip in, we need a zip that is longer than the gap that it's going to go into. And that'll make more sense as we're going along, and you'll find out why this is so crucial and why it makes such a big difference. Then we're going to put the zip back at the top of the sample, and I've lined the metal bit here with this lower pin, which is where I dropped it down slightly. And I'm going to feed the zip down smoothly, making sure it's nice and flat. And once it's laid flat on your garment along the seam line, I'm going to put a pin across on this higher mark. So this one at the bottom here is where the end of the teeth sit. This is where I've put this higher mark, so we've got this extra bit here. If your zip is a lot longer than the gap it's going to go into, just work out where you want the top of the seam to sit and how long a gap you want for your zip to sit in. So this pin's here, that's marking that point on the zip. Then we are a bit old school, we don't like our tacking. So I've actually tacked it together with proper tacking thread. If you're only doing this as a sample, you must probably be okay leaving it pinned. But if you're on a garment, it is worth doing, particularly if it's on a curve, because it'll stop the seam shifting backwards and forwards. I've left my pin in. This is the point here where the end of the gap for the zip finishes and the top of the seam for the rest of the garment is below it here. Now we're going to machine. On our sample, because we haven't stitched any of the seam together first, we're going to go from the top. We're going to put the machine on a long stitch. So on my machine, it was on 5. And you're going to machine down, no reversing at the top. You can just set off. Start here, machine down your seam line. So I'm 1.5 centimetres in on this sample. And I'm going to stop at the point where the pin was, marking the top of your seam and the end of the gap where the zip's sitting. I'm going to break the thread. You don't need to reverse or anything because this is a temporary machine tacking stitch that we're going to pull out. When I've done that, I'm going to set my machine to whatever stitch length I'm going to use to stitch the garment together. I'm going to reverse here and I'm going to stitch in the same direction. So I'm still going from the top down. This is really key because if you go one way and then go the other, however careful you are, you're going to create a pucker at the bottom where these two seams meet. If you keep going in the same direction, down to here with your big stitch, snap your thread, reverse, set off on whatever size stitch you're going to use, set off from the same point here, you won't create the pucker at the end of the zip. Now, if you've got a garment and you've already stitched part of the seam together, maybe to try it on, you need to do this slightly differently. So before we came from the top down, but we've already stitched from here down towards the bottom of the garment. This time we're going to turn your garment round and we're going to do what we don't normally do, is we're going to stitch from the bottom up to the top. Because again, if you're going in the same direction all the time, you're not going to create a pucker at the end of here. If I went from the top down to meet it, it would make a little ripple here, which there's nothing you can do about that. It'll still show on the outside when you've put your zip in. Don't forget this bit is a long stitch here. Now we're going to press. We're only going to press the bit from below where the point was where the 2 lines of stitching meet, which is where I've put this pin. We're only going to press the bottom part of the sample or on your garment. So we're only going to press the seam. We're not going to press where the zip's going, which is this part here. The fact it's unpressed will help it roll and hide the teeth of the zip at the end. I see some instructions and they turn it over and they press on the right side. You shouldn't really ever press on the right side, but if you do that once your zip's in, you're just going to part it here and you've kind of undone all the work, all the careful work you've done to get to that point. So just press the bottom bit here. We're now getting ready to actually put our zip in. So before you start, just double check that you've got your zip the correct way around. It should be like the zip at the top of the picture with the pull underneath and the teeth on the top, and you're laying the zip against the ditch on top of the seam allowances so that you're on the wrong side of the garment. Always worth double checking because it's really frustrating if it goes in the wrong way and then you have to unpick it. Now we're going to position our zip so that we can pin and tack it into place. So I've started here. Just remember you need to line the top of the metal with your stay stitching line, and then you need to get your zip and you need to roll the centre of the zip, which is where the teeth meet, down the ditch of the seam. And as you're rolling it down, pin on one side through all the layers, but you're only pinning as far as the top of the seam here where the pin is. Nothing happens below the pin. It's worth remembering that because it really helps as you're going along. Make sure it's pinned in really firmly as you're coming down. Don't forget this bit here where you've got to drop the stopper on a little bit. The first couple of I forgot that, and I ended up with it sticking up and I had to unpick the whole lot. So just remember to drop it down there, pin as far as the pin here. And I have got a little video for you to look at. Click. So I'm now rolling the zip down. I've placed it slightly lower on that lower mark and I'm pinning through all the layers. It's lining it up and pinning it down. But I'm only going as far as that pin which marks the top of the seam, the bottom of the zip placement. So the end is loose. You should have a dangly bit at the end. So now we've got it in place, what we're going to do is we're going to pick up the opposite side and we're going to tack it, but we're only tacking through the seam allowance and the tape on the zip. We're not going to go through into the garment. The pins on this side that you've just put in are to hold the zip in place while you tack this side. You need to use a little, well, I usually use a little knot and a back stitch, small stitches as close to the teeth as you can get. When you get up to the top, do a couple of back stitches to hold it in really firmly. Pick it up. You can always slide a bit of cardboard or something under here or a bit of paper so that you don't catch the other side of your garment. But when you pick it up, just double check it that it hasn't caught any of the threads on your garment side. It should be completely loose like this. And again, nothing happens below the pin. We're only tacking from the pin up to the top like this. When you've done that side, you need to take the pins out and do it on the other side so that the whole of your zip is tacked in place. And at this stage, don't panic. We're going to unpick the big temporary tacking stitch, pull it out because it's done its job now, but once it's out, you will see the teeth on the zip and a bit of the tape. Don't panic, it's not a problem. They are going to disappear when we machine it in. Now we're going to pull the zipper down to the bottom, right to the bottom of the zip. So there's a little gap here. You need to wiggle this pull here through the gap. If you find this fiddly, what you can do before you pull it down is just tie in a piece of ribbon or something through the gap on the pull here so that you've got something to grab hold of to pull down. You're going to pull it right down to the bottom. And this is why this method works so well, because when we come to stitch in the zip on the machine, the stopper is well out of the way, which is why you need a zip that is longer than the gap that it's going to go into. If you've done it and you end up with a stopper really close to the end here, I would kind of backtrack and do it again because it's going to make it really difficult and you're going to struggle. When I was taught to do conceal zips 20 odd years ago, we used to use a method where we stitched in the teeth on the zip first, and then we used to have to try and stitch up the seam so that we met the bottom of the zip. And it was absolutely hopeless because you couldn't get high enough. It slipped out the way even if you tacked it. And I just didn't find it very successful. And I didn't do them very often because I was never very happy with the look. So once I found how to do it with this method, it's really easy and you do get used to it and you can do it quite quickly. But it is the fact that there's this gap, there's more zip than the gap it's going into so that you can get the stopper out the way. Now this is where the magic pin's going to come in. We've pulled the zip down and we need to turn the fabric so that it's flat. If you've done a traditional zip, you kind of need to forget about that because it's a different method. We need the zip and the garment fabric completely flat. Now you need to get your pin. This is my magic pin for doing this. It was a bit of a revelation for this lady. She was amazed at what she'd achieved. So that's when it got nicknamed the magic pin. And we're going to pull the teeth of the zip over so that they're touching the top of the seam. And this is why you need to reverse when you're stitching your seam so that it's really firm and it's not going to pull apart. And we're going to pin through the tape with the metal of the pin on the top with it flat. Now this is the tricky bit, and it makes it more tricky because I'm not actually here to kind of flip it over and show you. So we're going to play a little video. Just have to undo that so it'll play, of the technique. So I'm actually folding it over flat. So this feels contrary to everything you've been taught about doing a zip. I'm pulling the teeth over so they're touching the top of the seam. I've got my pin and I'm pinning across. So the whole thing is flat. And we're going to stitch one side at one time and then we're going to do the other side as like two separate movements, if you like. Put my laser back on. And then we're going to machine from the top of the zip. So you need to tuck the coil of the teeth into the archway so that the nose or the middle of your foot is sitting on this side of your teeth, on this side of the zip. When you come to do the other side, you've got an archway on this side. Just check that your needle's in the middle and it's going to machine it in this ditch here. And we start right at the top. You can reverse if you want to. I find it doesn't really make much difference. You might have to get a hold of the threads, or if you've left the chain of the overlocking on, that works quite well, because sometimes you need to give it a bit of a tug to get it over the little plastic bit at the top of the teeth. Sometimes the little plastic bit right at the top of the teeth on the zip has kind of been stuck down a bit. You might need to get your thumbnail in there and just flick it if it's a bit sticky. And then you need to set off. I've put my stitch length maybe a fraction longer than I've been using to machine the garment together, because sometimes they are quite thick. Now the trick with this is you need to run this nose or the middle of your foot in this ditch, and you need to keep pushing the teeth over flat. Just take your time and work down it slowly and keep flicking the teeth over. The coil of the teeth will still sit in this little archway, but we're aiming to get as near to the edge of them here as we can. If you don't hold it down, they flick back towards the needle and you catch the edge and it kind of stitches the teeth down, which means it's a bit awkward to unpick. But just go nice and steady, keeping the teeth really, really flat. Now with this method, if the first time you do it, you don't get close enough to the teeth, it's not a problem. You don't have to unpick anything. You would just go again. You might find if you've not done one before, it takes you a couple of attempts to dare to get close enough. Now, do you remember our magic pin across the bottom? When we get to the bottom, when the nose or the front of the foot hits the pin, you've gone far enough. Don't try and get any further down, but just carefully reverse. Again, nothing happens below that magic pin. When you've done that side, you need to move on to the other side. So you'll need to move it over to this side of the foot and stitch down the other side. It does feel a little bit of like left and right handed. One side always seems a bit easier than the other. But again, as long as you've got the teeth flat and you've got the coil of the teeth in the correct archway, you should be fine. When you've finished, I've kind of picked the seam allowance up. This bit here is where the zip is, where the tacking is. This is seam here that's been pressed. And you might find, particularly if you've got this foot with the nose on the front, you've got a little bit of a gap here. Don't worry about that. That's absolutely fine. You're not going to have a gap when you're finished. If you can get them as much in line as you possibly can, that really helps as well. So I've got my foot on my machine, I've got the nose pointing forward, and I'm just checking that the needle's sitting in the middle, so that looks absolutely fine. Don't worry about the thread being under the foot, it'll get dragged along and it won't get caught, it'll be fine. So I'm just pushing the zip under the archway, making sure the coil of the teeth are in there and that the nose on the foot, or the front of your foot if you haven't got one with the nose in, is sitting down the ditch on the teeth. I'm just giving it a little bit of a push carefully just to get it going, and then I'm going to machine down. I'm flicking the teeth over because I'm aiming to stitch right in that ditch there. Just go steady, you'll soon get the hang of it. I just keep flicking the teeth over, realigning myself. You'll get your eye in after you've done a couple. So you can see how the teeth are being held in that archway. I'm just repositioning myself at the bottom so that it's nice and flat. You can see the magic pin. I'm heading towards it. Now when that nose hits the pin, I'm going to stop. I've gone far enough and I'm just going to reverse carefully. You can see the bit of top thread just through the hole, but that's not a problem. When you pull it out, it'll disappear. That's it. One side's done. And then we're going to get a hold of the stopper, we're going to wriggle it through the hole at the bottom here, and we're going to pull it right up to the top of the zip, at which stage you'll see whether you've got close enough. If you haven't, don't worry, just pull it back down, wiggle it back through again and go again, but always go from the top down. On some zips that we've done in the past, kind of the standard zip, sometimes you go one way and then you go the other, but with this you do need to be going top to bottom. And the last thing is, once you've got your zip in and you're happy with it, and also when I'll go back a slide, there's no pucker at the bottom, the zip's in the right place so that when I turn this over to put the facing on or the waistband, it's going to end up flush here. The last thing you have to do is, if your zip's far too long, is bind it off really firmly with double thread on a needle, kind of stitch round and round, and then you can chop the extra off at the bottom. But you need to machine this bottom bit of your zip to your seam allowance. Don't go through into your garment, just pick up the seam allowance and go through there. Because we've got extra zip, if it's wafting about, that's when they fail. It'll just hold it in place. I hope that's all made sense, and I'm sure you'll have lots of success doing your conceal zips. If you've got any problems, just get in touch with me. But thank you so much for watching.